Something important has changed in the Black Sea, and most people do not yet see the real meaning behind it. While attention stays fixed on maps in eastern Ukraine, on artillery exchanges, trenches, and small shifts in front lines, a deeper transformation is unfolding along the coast. It is quiet, almost hidden, but far more significant. The widening of the Odessa Corridor is not simply a humanitarian measure or a technical solution for shipping. It is a strategic signal with consequences that stretch beyond Ukraine. For years, Odessa was seen as protected, a port city shielded by geography, international rules, and Western assurances. That belief no longer holds. The corridor linked to Odessa, once narrow and carefully overseen, is now contested and under continuous pressure. Europe's key trade routes are no longer operating under certainty, but under a fragile, temporary tolerance that can be withdrawn at any moment. This is not just a story about one city and not even mainly about Ukraine. What we are watching is the slow reordering of control in the northern Black Sea, a critical space connecting Eurasian production centers with European consumers. Grain, energy materials, fertilizers, and metals all depend on open passage through this waterway. When passage becomes conditional, the shock travels outward, touching the Danube basin, the Balkans, southern Europe, and eventually the industrial heart of the European Union. For decades, Odessa represented continuity. Even when politics were unstable or tensions rose in the region, trade continued, ships arrived, contracts were fulfilled, and markets adjusted without collapse. This history helped create a dangerous illusion that trade systems were somehow separate from power struggles. That illusion is now breaking down. Piece by piece, the changing power balance is becoming visible. It is not about dramatic naval battles or clear blockades. It is pressure without formal announcement. Long-range missiles, drones, constant monitoring, insurance uncertainty, and risk calculations are layered together, quietly changing behavior. Ships still move, but fewer than before. Cargo still leaves, but with higher costs and more hesitation. The port remains open, but its core strength reliability is weakening steadily. Here is where the balance of power is shifting, not through territory being seized, but through leverage. Leverage over markets and over governments, and over leaders suddenly realizing that their economic stability now depends on conditions they cannot fully control. The expansion of the Odessa Corridor is not simply proof of resilience, it is also evidence of strain. It shows that old rules no longer fully apply and that waters once considered neutral have effectively become contested space. To understand why this moment matters, we need to look back at how Odessa became so central, why people assumed it would always be secure, and how that assumption is now being taken apart step by step. Europe is not yet fully prepared for the consequences of this change. Odessa has never been an ordinary coastal city. From its founding in the late 18th century, its role was intentional and strategic. It was designed as a southern gateway to the wider world, a point where the wealth of the interior could meet global markets. Grain from fertile plains, coal and metals from inland regions, and later industrial goods all moved toward this single outlet before traveling onward to Europe and beyond. Over time, Odessa became more than a marketplace. It evolved into a strategic connector between political authority and economic movement. Whoever influenced Odessa held access, leverage, and the ability to shape outcomes far beyond its shoreline. This importance did not fade when governments changed or borders shifted. Through wars, revolutions, and the Soviet period, Odessa remained one of the most crucial maritime outlets, supporting industry, supplying markets, and anchoring trade networks across vast distances. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many assumed that Odessa might lose some of its relevance. Instead, the city became even more central. Independent Ukraine inherited one of Eastern Europe's most valuable port systems, and Odessa quickly emerged as a lifeline for the country's economy. By the early 2000s, it was handling millions of tons of cargo every year, shipping out grain, sunflower oil, fertilizers, steel, and manufactured goods. These exports were not just statistics. They fed markets in the European Union, the Middle East, and Africa, and they helped keep Ukraine's economy functioning. Odessa was not optional, it was essential. Then 2014 marked a sharp turning point. The annexation of Crimea fundamentally altered Ukraine's position at sea. Sevastopol, the primary naval hub and maritime anchor, was lost. Almost overnight, Odessa shifted from being a key economic asset to becoming a strategic necessity. Without it, Ukraine's access to the sea and its ability to trade as a sovereign nation narrowed dramatically. This shift was noticed outside Ukraine as well. Western attention intensified. NATO navies increased visits, intelligence sharing expanded, and surveillance of the Black Sea became more routine. Publicly, these actions were described as reassurance and deterrence, but underneath was a clearer realization. Odessa had become a fault line in European security. By the time large-scale war erupted in 2022, Odessa was no longer seen simply as infrastructure. It had become a symbol of Ukraine's economic survival and political resilience, yet symbolism could not guarantee safety. Geography itself had not changed, but control of geography was increasingly contested. Over the past year, the environment around Odessa has been transformed through gradual steps rather than single dramatic events. Missile strikes, drone activity, naval maneuvers, electronic monitoring, and economic pressure have layered together. What was once considered stable is now conditional. What once moved freely now does so under threat. The shift from open passage to contested access is not a temporary disturbance. It marks a critical threshold. It explains why the expansion of the Odessa Corridor matters. It is part of a broader change in how access to the sea is controlled, who sets the terms, and how power is exercised without formally declaring it. The Odessa Corridor was originally introduced as a practical solution, a narrow maritime route meant to keep exports moving despite the wider conflict. It was presented as a commercial mechanism, a way to maintain trade flows while larger military tensions continued. Its success depended on several assumptions: that escalation would be limited, that behavior at sea would remain predictable, and that outside guarantees would be enough to keep the route functioning. Those assumptions have gradually been disproven. In recent months, Russia has expanded its operational reach across the northwestern Black Sea, not through a traditional surface blockade, but through steady layered pressure. Instead of openly sealing sea lanes, the strategy focuses on reshaping decisions over time. Missiles from Crimea now cover deeper maritime approaches. Drone attacks against port infrastructure serve as reminders of constant vulnerability rather than total destruction. Naval mines and unmanned surface vessels complicate routing and force detours. Constant electronic and aerial surveillance has turned the northern Black Sea into a monitored operating environment rather than a neutral commercial zone. The consequences of this strategy are subtle yet decisive. Insurance companies raise premiums or withdraw coverage, ship owners rethink schedules, departures are delayed, and vessels choose longer routes to avoid perceived risks. Port operations slow not because the port has been physically destroyed, but because confidence has been weakened. In particular, grain shipments have become irregular, pushing exporters to use less efficient and costlier alternatives. There is no official declaration of blockade, and none is needed. The goal is to insert enough uncertainty that every voyage becomes a calculated risk. Modern trade depends on predictability. Once predictability is removed, even small disruptions produce large effects. This is a classic example of sea denial. It is not about absolute control of the Black Sea, but about having enough influence to impose costs and shape behavior. The very expansion of the Odessa Corridor reflects this pressure. Routes stretch farther, become narrower, and expose ships to more surveillance and more insurance risk as they try to avoid danger. These changes are often described publicly as adaptation, but they are just as much evidence of constraint and vulnerability. This approach also sidesteps the political cost of an outright attack on Odessa. The city remains under Ukrainian control, and most infrastructure still stands, but its ability to function at full scale is being slowly reduced. Strategically, that is more efficient than occupation. A port that exists but cannot operate reliably already achieves much of the desired effect. The objective is not necessarily to seize Odessa physically, but to make its future uncertain enough that the world adjusts without noticing a single decisive moment. The question, therefore, is no longer whether Odessa has fallen. Clearly, it has not. The real question is whether it can continue to function as the economic engine it once was under sustained pressure. If it cannot, then the consequences extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. They affect regional balance, European markets, and the broader understanding of who controls access to the Black Sea and on what terms. This is where many Western assessments miss the point. Too much focus remains on territory and not enough on reliability. Economic systems draw strength not only from ownership, but from trust that they will work tomorrow the same way they did today. When that trust erodes, so does power, even without a change of flags on the map. Russia's choice not to occupy Odessa outright is often interpreted as lack of capability or hesitation, but a closer look suggests something different. Occupation would require massive forces, long and costly urban fighting, and almost certainly trigger a far broader confrontation with the West. Instead, a more calculated method is being used, one that wears down Odessa's functionality without provoking a decisive military response. By sustaining pressure on maritime access, Russia is gradually turning Odessa into a port that exists more in theory than in reliable practice. It remains on maps and in official statistics, but its predictability as a trading hub is being chipped away. From a systems perspective, this achieves many of the same outcomes as capturing the city while avoiding the political and military burden of holding it. The strategy fits within a larger approach of economic pressure. Limiting Ukraine's export capacity does not just affect Ukraine, it sends shockwaves through European and global markets. Reduced grain shipments influence food prices, fertilizer delays affect agricultural production months later, and insurance instability disrupts shipping far beyond the Black Sea. These developments rarely dominate headlines, but their effects accumulate quietly. This kind of indirect pressure works because it targets a key Western vulnerability: reliance on constant and uninterrupted trade flows. Western economies are designed around efficiency, lean inventories, and just-in-time systems. They function best in predictable environments. Once that predictability disappears, leaders face complex choices that carry political costs at home. NATO naval forces are present in the wider region, but their freedom to act is limited by legal concerns, escalation risks, and differing national interests among member states. They can monitor and signal, but sustaining decisive control of the sea is far more difficult. This imbalance works to Russia's advantage. It only needs to keep pressure at a level the West is reluctant to counter directly while avoiding steps that would force an immediate and unified response. In doing so, it maintains the initiative without constant escalation. The wider meaning of this strategy becomes clearer when we shift from immediate events to broader patterns. The Black Sea is no longer a peripheral theater. It is becoming a testing ground for a form of competition that targets economies rather than just armies. The lack of dramatic explosions does not mean the absence of harm. What we are watching is economic coercion without open confrontation. Supply chains, port operations, insurance markets, and shipping routes are being shaped by steady risk rather than outright closure. If this method continues to prove effective, an obvious question follows: how far can it be extended? From here, the path ahead does not point in a single fixed direction. Instead, multiple potential escalation tracks exist, each shaped by restraint, misreading of signals, or rising pressure within the system. None of these paths guarantees stability. They only shift who feels the strain first and in what form. The most probable outcome may not be a dramatic turning point, but the normalization of disruption. In such a future, there is no formal blockade and no single decisive incident. Instead, shipping adapts to constant pressure. Insurance remains costly, travel times lengthen, cargo volumes slowly shrink. Odessa continues operating, but on a reduced scale, transformed from a major engine of commerce into a constrained and uncertain node. This slow economic erosion is often more dangerous than open confrontation because it rarely triggers urgent political action. There are no dramatic images of burning ports, only the steady tightening of constraints that quietly changes how economies function. Over time, this pressure weakens Ukraine's export capacity and reduces Europe's resilience. The public may not immediately notice when a ship is delayed or rerouted, but they eventually feel higher prices, shortages, and rising frustration. This kind of pressure destabilizes societies without tank battles or headline-grabbing offensives. It works in the space between perception and reality, where daily life still looks normal while structural vulnerabilities deepen beneath the surface. A second possible path forward is the increased militarization of protection. Ukraine, with Western backing, could try to reinforce defenses around Odessa through more air defense systems, expanded maritime escorts, and stronger fortifications. On paper, this makes the port safer. In practice, it increases the odds of incidents at sea or in the air. Close encounters between escorts and hostile assets, misread signals, or accidental engagements involving drones or surveillance craft could rapidly escalate the conflict. Any event involving NATO forces would immediately raise the stakes and shift the situation from indirect pressure to direct confrontation. That risk extends beyond the Black Sea and into broader European security. A third scenario involves the widening of pressure beyond Odessa. When access to one route becomes difficult, traffic shifts elsewhere and pressure follows. The Danube Delta, overland routes, and nearby ports in Romania and other countries may increasingly carry the burden. This does not end the problem, it spreads it. Energy flows, river transport, and supporting infrastructure all become part of the same strategic contest. The conflict's footprint expands while its underlying character remains the same, gradually turning what was once viewed mainly as Ukraine's challenge into a broader European economic problem. There is also the ever-present nuclear backdrop. Even without the use of nuclear weapons, their existence shapes every decision. The possibility of escalation acts as a ceiling, encouraging indirect forms of competition because no side wants to cross thresholds that could trigger catastrophic responses. Under these conditions, economic warfare becomes a preferred instrument. It applies constant pressure while staying below the line that would justify extreme retaliation. This is a defining feature of modern great power rivalry: conflict without formal declarations, competition without full-scale war, and persistent pressure applied through markets, logistics, and finance rather than solely through armies in the field. Across these scenarios, one element is consistent. None of them return the world to the earlier assumption of open, predictable maritime trade. Uncertainty becomes structural. Risk is shifted onto insurers, consumers, peripheral regions, and ultimately ordinary people who experience the consequences through living costs, job insecurity, and social tension. The battle space is no longer limited to trenches or coastlines. It extends into global supply chains, commodity markets, and the daily functioning of economies. The damage accumulates quietly, but shapes political stability and long-term security far more than occasional bursts of fighting. Every disrupted shipment carries ripple effects that rarely appear on maps, but influence food availability, price levels, and social calm. As Odessa's maritime access remains under pressure, the effects spread outward into regions already economically vulnerable. Black Sea grain exports are not abstract statistics. They support food systems in North Africa, the Middle East, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Delays raise prices. Governments attempt to shield populations, but financial limits appear quickly and frustration grows. Europe experiences these consequences differently, but no less seriously. Manufacturing sectors rely on steady supplies of raw materials, fertilizer, and energy-related inputs. When shipping becomes unpredictable, inventories fall, production schedules slip, and costs rise. Insurance markets tighten, adding another layer of expense. These increases eventually reach households who face higher prices and fewer options. Inside Ukraine, the human cost is even more direct. Port workers, customs officials, and entire regional economies depend on Odessa's activity. When operations decline, local economies contract, jobs disappear, municipal revenues fall, and infrastructure becomes harder to maintain. These communities often suffer invisibly, far from the front lines and cameras, experiencing slow economic decline rather than sudden destruction. Yet it is precisely this quiet erosion that determines endurance in long conflicts. States can cope with battlefield losses for some time if their economies function. They struggle when economic pressure grinds on without relief. For Europe, the broader lesson is unavoidable. The belief that maritime trade exists outside geopolitical competition has collapsed. Shipping routes are strategic terrain, Lifelines that are not protected, diversified, or made resilient become levers in the hands of those willing to apply sustained pressure. This reality forces difficult questions about how much uncertainty societies can tolerate and who carries the burden of securing the economic arteries on which prosperity depends. These are not abstract strategic debates. They are questions for voters, policymakers, and entire societies that have grown used to stability without recognizing how fragile it can be. All of this brings us back to the present moment and what the expansion of the Odessa Corridor truly signals. It is not the resolution of a crisis, but a symptom of a deeper structural shift in the Black Sea from guaranteed access to conditional tolerance. And tolerance, unlike law or geography, can be withdrawn at any moment. The challenge now is whether decision makers recognize this as a strategic warning and respond accordingly, or whether the slow pressure continues until its full cost becomes impossible to ignore.